Now that we have all of our instruments ready and we have added some reverb to them, we can actually start to think about arranging some horns. The first thing we have to ask is how or where do we start? Of course, if someone asks you to arrange some horns or a brass section for an example such as this, you could reach into your library of loops or samples and simply go through them all and choose ones that suit the music. The problem with this is that you can spend a huge amount of time looking through your library and finding some loops or samples that kind of fit, but you have virtually no flexibility. You also run the risk of forgetting what is really needed to actually enhance the music. One possibility is to analyze certain loops. If you discover a loop that sounds good but does not fit the sections you need it in, you can analyze it and work out how it was created and then replicate it using your software. Another option is to play the music in order to get some idea of where it is going harmonically and then to use something like a piano to play over the top. To do this, I'm using the True Pianos library here. Listening to the piece, we can hear that there are quite a few chord changes. And having analysed the piece, I know the chord changes, which are C7, F7, F7-9, C7-9, and a middle section. Now that we know those chords, we can always go through our loop libraries and select the relevant loops that are in the correct key. You can then experiment with the loops, and at the very least, you will see how these instruments fit into the arrangement, and you can learn from this. Each instrument has its own place and method within an arrangement. Even if the alto sax and the trumpet both belong in the brass section, they are very different instruments. And so it's very useful to understand what each instrument can do. You can also feel free to ask a fellow musician who plays one of the instruments to explain some of the techniques and even limitations of that instrument. So having a knowledge of the instruments really will help you create a realistic arrangement. In our example here, I will first choose the trumpet. And if we open the instrument, we can see that by playing a note in the blue section of the keyboard, we can articulate it using the key switches to the left. If you look carefully, you can see that by pressing the B key in the key switch section, it creates the typical fall-down effect that trumpets use. However, depending on how hard I strike the B key, it affects how long the fall-down lasts. So, if I want the trumpet fall down to be short, I strike the key harder. And likewise, by striking it gently, the fall down lasts longer. So this means that I can fit my fall down to the tempo of the piece. So let's record a short section of the trumpet, and you will see me recording the key switches to create the fall down, whilst also playing the melody with my right hand. Now, if we look at the MIDI data, we can see that the breath controller has been recorded as the controller display shows below. And also we can see the melody and the key switches. So the first thing we notice is that the key switches are triggered halfway through the note, and that triggers the fall down. Then, in the next section, we can see that the G sustains into the A note. This is important as it creates the articulation required between those notes, and the following notes are played staccato. The next section is very similar to the first section. And then we arrive at a long note just before the final section. An important element of this long note is that the breath controller drops the expression right down and then brings it up over the length of the note. This creates a very typical effect that is commonplace in brass instruments. The last 5 notes have a slight rhythmic issue. The timing of my breathing and playing is not quite in sync. This is of course quite a difficult thing to perform perfectly, and will require practice if you choose to use something like a breath controller. Simply practicing with a breath controller a couple of minutes a day will allow you to get used to using it though. To fix the slight issue we have here, rather than simply play it in again, I do have the option to use the quantize function, just for these 5 notes. However, we obviously don't want this to sound strictly quantized. So once again, we can adjust the strength of our quantization. For the minute, it is set to 60%, and I'll lower it slightly to 50%. If this was set to 100%, then each note would be positioned exactly on the closest 16th note. This is not what we want. By choosing 50%, it will move the note closer to the closest 16th note, but not necessarily place them exactly on those notes. This allows us to keep a more natural rhythm and feel. So I'll quantize those 5 notes, and then we can listen once more. If we look at the notes just before the section we've been working on, we can see that I played slightly in advance of the division lines. This is not a problem, as to be honest, with brass instruments, there is already a slight delay from when you blow into them until the sound actually arrives. And also, the effect of anticipating the rhythm can give the brass section some drive. Of course, you have the option to quantize strictly and then compare to your original. In doing so, you will see which version suits your arrangement better. Sometimes, the quantized version will be perfect, but often it sounds too mechanical. Then the unquantized version may work better. These kind of choices depend on the music, the specific library, and the arrangement. What is important is that your first instrument is recorded exactly how you want it to be, as you will be basing all of the following instruments around that instrument. If the first instrument is slightly out of time, or doesn't quite have the feel you want, then everything that you add will also not be correct. Let's listen once more. Now we come to adding further instruments. And although, if time is of the essence, you might consider recording all of the instruments together, especially if they are playing the same melody, the problem is that a saxophone is played differently to a trombone. So to create a realistic brass section, we really need to record each instrument separately. Also, the fact that the timing will be fractionally different will create more realism. If you decide to copy sections, then of course you have the option to go in and move individual notes slightly backwards or forwards in time to create this effect. But to be honest, it will probably take you longer than actually just recording the section again. Now, let's record the following tracks. If we look at the alto sax instrument, you can see the different articulation taking place here in the central display. I'm playing the instrument with the keyboard and once again controlling the dynamics from my breath controller. If you look at the keyboard whilst I play, you can see that depending on the dynamics I use, I can control the timing of the portamento effect. One thing I also want available on the saxophone is the fall-down effect. We can see if this is available to us in the central screen. And just like on the trumpet, we can create this effect by using the key switches. It also works in much the same manner in the sense that if I press softly, the fall down is slow, and if I hit the key hard, the fall down is faster. So now let's record the alto saxophone. One thing we can notice straight away is just how much richer it is with both instruments playing. If we listen to the saxophone alone, and then with the trumpet, there is a big difference. Now we can add the tenor saxophone, which is doubling the melody, but is playing it one octave lower. Once again, we can see the key switches that create the fall-down effect. Listening back, there is a section that could be somewhat better. And so, I will use the intelligent quantize option. If time was not critical, I would spend it playing each section in as well as I could, but for now this is a perfectly acceptable solution. Now we get to the trombone. We haven't looked at this instrument yet, but it is from the same library and runs under the contact player. As you can hear, this is an excellent trombone instrument. The one thing I need to do is to find out which key switch is the key switch for creating the fall down. So now I've found the key switch, I can go back and record. So now let's listen to the whole thing once again, but without the click. Listening back, you have surely noticed that although the majority of the melody is played unisono, as in they are all playing the same melody, we do have a variation in this section. We can hear that this section sounds funkier because of the harmonies. It's very common to use fourths or fifths to create these harmonies, as they give a very jazzy or funky feel. And can be used to give your arrangement added depth and richness. So that's our first example, and obviously it could be improved upon if we had the time, but it certainly gives you an idea of what you can achieve fairly quickly with a very simple brass section.